Hey, Southern Gothic fans! Join us online now at southerngothicmedia.com. There you can find podcast updates, links to our social media, and subscription access to our new members-only series, Southern Gothic: The Monsters, narrated by me, Brittany Schexnayder.
Over 2.75 million soldiers fought in the Civil War, the vast majority for the Union, as the Confederate Army was severely outnumbered during the conflict, with a mere 750,000 in its ranks. Most of these soldiers were farmers prior to their enlistment, primarily native-born sons between the ages of 18 to 29, often driven to enlist just as much by the steady paycheck of $11 a month as by ideals of patriotism or the contemporary fear of a society based on racial equality. Tragically, over 260,000 of these Confederate soldiers lost their lives in the struggle between states. But less than half of those deaths were actually in battle itself. Harsh wartime living conditions made soldiers susceptible to disease, giving the men of the Confederate Army an horrific 1 in 5 chance of dying from illness and infection. These men were sons, brothers, and fathers. And one in particular, an otherwise average Confederate volunteer, was my very own 4 times great-grandfather. A 29-year-old private that family oral histories have claimed returned home for one last visit after dying in an Army encampment from typhoid fever. My name is Brandon Schexnayder, and you are listening to Southern Gothic. On December 8, 1860, the United States Secretary of the Treasury, Howell Cobb, resigned from his post in President James Buchanan's cabinet and returned to his home in Georgia. There, he and his brother Thomas would begin lobbying the state legislature to consider an ordinance of secession from the Union. After decades of turmoil, the nation's political parties had become so divided over abolition and the expansion of slavery into new territories that the election of Northern Republican Abraham Lincoln became practically inevitable. But since Lincoln did not even appear on the ballot in 9 Southern states, many in the South, including Secretary Howell, felt his presidency was forced upon them by the North. So only 2 weeks later, on December 20th, 1860, South Carolina became the first state of the Union to adopt an ordinance of secession. Georgia would soon follow suit. Howell Cobb then traveled to Montgomery, Alabama, where he personally presided over a convention of Southern delegates who would create and adopt a new constitution that formed the Confederate States of America. Cobb was then elected president of this provisional Congress, a position he would serve for only 2 weeks before administering the presidential oath of office to Jefferson Davis himself. 2 months later, on April 12th, the Confederate Army fired on federal troops at Fort Sumter, South Carolina, and the Civil War had begun. Cobb, a longtime politician who had not only served 5 terms in the United States House of Representatives, but also several years as the governor of Georgia, then joined the Confederate Army. He was commissioned as a colonel for the 16th Georgia Infantry, then returned home the following summer to raise a regiment of volunteers. And in no time at all, 880 men enlisted, filling 10 companies. Nicodemus Kidd was one of these men. Georgia native Nicodemus Robert Kidd was born in 1832 to Miles Webb Kidd and Melinda Griffin of Mecklenburg County, Virginia. His parents were farmers who came to Georgia with their families in the early 19th century before marrying and starting a family. Nicodemus followed in their footsteps, continuing to farm, but never acquiring any land of his own. Then in 1850, he wed Sarah Ann Carter from Pulaski, Georgia. They had 4 children, 3 girls named Elizabeth, Holly, and Sarah, and a boy named William, after Nicodemus's grandfather, a veteran of the Revolutionary War. The old man, who had passed away when Nicodemus was in his teens, was only 15 himself when he volunteered to fight for the 7th Virginia Regiment of the Continental Army. According to the historic unit's muster rolls, the young private likely saw combat during the Continental Army's attempts to control Philadelphia, engaging British soldiers at both the Battle of Brandywine and the Battle of Germantown, before spending the winter at the infamous Valley Forge. At some point during this time, William either fell ill or was injured, and was discharged in February of 1778. But now, 7 decades later, Nicodemus would follow in his grandfather's footsteps and voluntarily take up arms for the Confederate cause in defense of his home. Unfortunately, he wouldn't be as lucky as his grandfather, and Nicodemus would not survive. On July 10th, 1861, Nicodemus Kidd enlisted as a private in the Confederate Army. The following day, he traveled from his home in Danielsonville, Georgia, to nearby Athens, and boarded a train headed to Richmond, Virginia, with his fellow volunteers that would soon become known as the Madison County Grays. The unit was formerly called Company A of the 16th Regiment Georgia Volunteer Infantry, and as part of the Army of Northern Virginia, They would set up camp outside of the new Confederate capital, where they'd prepare for battle. But Richmond was more than just the political center for the Confederacy. It was also an economic powerhouse that boasted a flourishing rail industry and a diversified economy that made it the strategic hub for ammunition, weapons, and supplies for the Confederate Army. Defending it was an absolute necessity. Unfortunately, conditions in these Army encampments were dismal. The Confederate government lacked the authority to impose revenue streams on the states to provide for their new army. Thus, sanitation and provisions were often severely lacking, making soldiers incredibly vulnerable to illness and disease. And within only 2 months of his arrival, Private Kidd fell ill himself, contracting one of the most dreaded epidemics, typhoid. Typhoid is a horrendous intestinal disease spread by water and food contaminated with the bacteria Salmonella typhi. Once ingested, the bacteria spreads to the spleen, where it multiplies, causing a fever to develop, as well as abdominal pain, headaches, and severe fatigue. Left untreated, rose spots develop on the chest and abdomen, and delirium takes hold before the often fatal blows of internal hemorrhaging, intestinal bleeding, and encephalitis. Today, typhoid is easily treated through antibiotics, but in the mid-19th century, not much could be done other than allow the disease to run its course under medical observation, while merely attending to the symptoms with mercury and chalk, as well as pain medication like opium. Then, on September 10th, 1861, exactly 2 months since he enlisted, Nicodemus Kidd succumbed to the sickness. He died in a hospital in Richmond, Virginia, never to return home to Madison County. But family legend claims otherwise. Word of Nicodemus's passing did not reach Madison County for quite some time, but it's believed his spirit visited home before his family was even aware of his fate. The story goes that one afternoon, one of Nicodemus's older daughters came running home to her mother screaming after taking a trip to see a friend at a nearby farm. When the young girl, either 7 or 9 years of age, finally calmed down enough to speak, she claimed that as she headed down the road, she encountered the ghost of her father sitting before her on a fence post. Scared beyond belief, she retreated to her mother. Kidd had been away from home for almost 3 months at this point, over 500 miles away. And as far as his wife Sarah and their children knew, he was still encamped in Richmond, not yet involved in any violent conflicts. Unfortunately, Sarah would receive a letter from Camp Bryan near Yorktown not long after, confirming the family's fear that the spirit may have in fact been their beloved. I hereby certify that Nicodemus R. Kidd, dead, late a private of my company, was enlisted by me at Danielsonville, Georgia, on the 10th day of July, 1861, and was mustered into the service of the Confederate States on the day thereafter, on the 11th day of July, 1861, at Athens, Georgia. Paid Nicodemus R. Kidd private, as aforesaid, departed this life at Richmond, Virginia, on the 10th day of September, 1861. Signed, James S. Golston, Captain of Company A, 16th Regiment, Georgia Volunteers. Private Kidd's body was laid to rest in the Soldiers section of the Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia, one of the largest cemeteries for Confederate burials during the Civil War. There, the simple farmer who had volunteered for service is set to spend eternity alongside not only more Confederate generals than any other cemetery in the country, but also the President of the Confederate States of America himself, Jefferson Davis. The Madison Grays would go on to fight in many of the major battles and skirmishes of the Civil War, from Gettysburg to Cold Harbor, until finally ending up at the Appomattox Courthouse, surrendering to the Union Army. The original regiment of 880 men had been decimated down to only 2 officers and 56 men. Had Kidd survived whatever brought his premature death, the odds were very much stacked against him making it home. Even if today, some believe he actually did. My name is Brandon Schexnayder, and you've been listening to Southern Gothic.
Southern Gothic is an independently released podcast with all content and music written and produced by Brandon Schexnayder. To keep up with future episodes, subscribe today on Apple's podcast app, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you're listening now.
Lucky Little Shacks.